Welcome to FO Talks. My name is Anton Schaubel, Fair Observer's Chief of Staff. With me is Jason Stearns, an American writer known for his extensive work on military conflict in the Congo since 2001. He's the author of The War That Doesn't Say Its Name and Dancing in the Glory of Monsters. Currently, he is a Center on International Cooperation Senior Fellow, the founder and chair of the Advisory Board of Congo Research Group, and a professor at Simon Fraser University. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you.
Conflict between the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda has been at the heart of Congo's wars since 1996. They have not slowed down. Just weeks ago, bombs landed on a refugee camp within Congolese territory, killing 12 people and injuring 20 others. And both Congo and the United States blamed Rwanda for the attack. Now, for those not familiar with Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda, this may seem a little surprising because on the map, the Democratic Republic of the Congo vastly dwarfs its eastern neighbor. So tell me, how did we get here? And how did tiny Rwanda become such a problem for Congo?
Well, thanks for having me. I think I have the luxury of giving you a longish answer. One of the problems with the Congo is that it's so complicated that often when talking about it, one reduces it, and instead of having a complex, multi-dimensional understanding, one gets a very flat, simplistic understanding. Usually, especially if you have to do a 3-minute television show or something like that, that's what it ends up being. But since we have a little bit more time, I think I can unpack it. I mean, the conflict and the current conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo dates back at least to 1996, which is when the first formal war began. And the antecedents to that began in 1993. But if you look at the Great Wars of the Congo that lasted from 1996 to 2003, and really is the beginning of this drama, there's 3 dimensions to it, and it's worthwhile understanding those 3 dimensions. There's a national, a local, and a regional or international dimension. The national dimension really has to do, and all of these 3 persist until today, which is why it's worthwhile digging into them a little bit. The national dimension is really the erosion of Congolese state institutions, and that dates back to the colonial period. Obviously, the Belgian colony that created this artificial country called the Congo, initially as the private fiefdom of a Belgian king, never intended for there to be a strong state. And so they left the Congolese with very weak state institutions and independence in 1960. And then the military ruler of the Congo for 32 years, Mobutu Sese Seko, with backing from his foreign allies, especially the United States, proceeded to erode state institutions even more in order to solidify his grip on power. And so the first dimension of this is really endemic, persistent state weakness. That's not state weakness because the Congolese somehow can't get their act together, but it's an intentional state weakness. Intentional first on the part of the Belgians, and then intentional on the part of the then ruler, but even today's rulers are similar dynamics. So understanding state weakness and who benefits from that state weakness, I think, is very important in all of this. So that's the first dimension. The second dimension is the local dimension. And often when we talk about conflict in the Congo, and even if you look at a map, there's roughly 100 different armed groups active in the Eastern Congo today. And almost all of those armed groups have an ethnic basis. And as a shorthand, people sometimes talk about ethnic antagonisms, ethnic tensions, and there's definitely ethnicity plays a very prominent role in conflict in the Congo, but we shouldn't take ethnicity at face value. It is something that from its very origins is politicized, and we need to understand ethnicity, I think, in its very roots. And so this local dimension really digs into the importance of ethnicity, how it was transformed, again, by the colonial system. Ethnicity is something very modern, and colonization had a lot to do with the creation, sometimes of artificial even ethnicities. And so a lot of the current conflict today, and the conflict as it began in 1996, is about this notion of who is and who is not Congolese. And the most important ethnic division is between the so-called indigenous Congolese, but you really have to use air quotes with that, and with people who are of foreign extraction, especially Rwandan or Kinyarwanda speaking origin, right? And so this again dates back to the colonial period, but there's this very deep divide between the Congolese and the Congolese Hutu and Tutsi populations, many of whom have been there for decades and even centuries. And that was certainly had a lot to do with the beginning of conflict in 1996. And then the third dimension is the regional dimension. And so the conflict was triggered by 1996, in part because Mobutu had used chaos and instability almost as a means of governance. He had invited armed groups from around the region to have their rear bases in his territory. And the most important one of these foreign armed groups that was hosted either willingly or unwillingly by the Congolese state was the Rwandan defeated Rwandan army that had just perpetrated the genocide in Rwanda and that had fled across the border into the Congo, along with 1 million refugees, along with the militias, the genocidal militias that had just perpetrated the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. And they continued launching attacks against Rwanda. But because there were numerous armed groups hosted in this country, the Congo back then, there were many countries in the region that had a bone to pick with Mobutu. And so the origins of this conflict, and again, all of these factors are still there today. The origin of this conflict was triggered by a Rwandan invasion to dismantle, basically a continuation of the Rwandan Civil War, but the Rwandan invasion to dismantle the refugee camps in the Eastern Congo. And then they continued on to topple Mobutu Sese Seko in Kinshasa with the help of allies. Many African countries participated in this. And then to install somebody that Rwanda felt that would be favorable to them. And in doing so, they took advantage of the state weakness, the weakness of the Congolese state. There's almost investment in weak institutions. And they took advantage of these fault lines between quote unquote indigenous Congolese and foreign Congolese. By mobilizing the Congolese Tootsi population in particular. That's a population you find both in Rwanda and in the Congo, and it's a population, the Tootsi people is a population from which the current ruler of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, also comes. And so they manipulated, or they mobilized, if you will, that cleavage to take advantage of that. And so those are the three, if you will, the three parts of this triple helix that continue to animate the conflict up until today. So I gave you that long backstory because it's important to understand that what's happening today is in some ways, of course the conflict has changed, but in some ways really has its roots going back then. And those three factors, the weakness of the Congolese state, those cleavages between who is Congolese and who is a foreigner, and the regional tensions and geopolitical power struggles between Rwanda and the Congo, and between many of these neighboring states, that persists until today. So to make a very long story short, and I will not get into the details of this because we don't have time, what happened after that was, after installing somebody favorable to them in Kinshasa in 1997, that person, his name was Laurent Kabila, fell out with his former Rwandan backers. That launched a second Congo War in 1998. That split the country into 4 or 5 different parts. There was a pro-Rwanda part, there was a pro-Uganda part, and there was a government part, and they fought for 5 years. It was a peace deal that then ushered in a democratic transition, a reunification of the country, and the country was reunified. Since then, we've had a democratic constitution. It's called the Third Congolese Republic, and we've had 1, 2, 3, 4 rounds of democratic elections since then, and most of the country has been stabilized, except for a very violent part of the East, about roughly the size of California or England's, in which conflict has fragmented, has escalated, and is almost kaleidoscopic in terms of how many different armed groups and factions and actors are involved. But this key fault line between Rwanda and the Congo has persisted until today. What Rwanda has done, and this is really almost the core of the conflict dynamics, is they've continued to back armed groups So harking back to 1996, very similar, accusing the Congolese state of backing its arch enemies, including people who participated in the genocide in 1994. And the M23 rebellion, that is one of the most important rebellions today, again, draws on Congolese Tootsi community, is backed by Rwanda, and is facing off against a Congolese state that has very, very hard time coming to grips with this insurgency, in part because it's invested in instability for so long that it really doesn't have a strong army to use on the battlefield. So that, without getting into a lot of the historical flag posts, that I think that describes the broad dynamics that has pitted Rwanda against the Congo. Now, there's many dimensions to that. We can get into that. There's a resource dimension and minerals. There is much more to say about this ethnic dimension, as well as about why Rwandan and Congolese state, both of them almost act counterintuitively in the sense that they both see conflict almost as an end in itself. And they both have become conflict entrepreneurs, if you will. And it's difficult to say that they are trying very hard to bring an end to this conflict.
Well, I appreciate the long answer. One of the things that we try to do is look at how the history of conflicts goes back much longer time than the news cycle would often suggest. If you try to read about what's going on in Congo and Rwanda right now, you might get the impression that the story starts in 2022.
That's right.
So I appreciate that you've laid out the groundwork. Now, since 2022, what has happened? What is going on today?
Yeah, thank you. That allows me to dig a little bit deeper into this most recent dynamic. So, in November of 2021, so maybe I'll step a little bit further back. So you had this back and forth basically between Rwanda and the Congo. This, resurgence. You had Rwanda back at 1, 2, 3, 4 different iterations of a similar armed group, basically, since 1996 until today. Then we have the election of a new president in the Congo. This is the first time there has been a democratic transfer of power in Congolese history. And in 2019, Felix Tshisekedi, who's the current president in the Congo, comes to power. He comes to power, and initially what he tries to do is, this is somebody who comes from the political opposition. This is somebody who does not have deep roots in the military. And he's coming to power. Power is being handed to him by somebody who created basically the modern Congolese military, Joseph Kabila, who was an army commander, who does have very deep roots in the army. And so Felix Tshisekedi is very nervous when he comes to power. And what he does initially is he looks for allies, especially in the security sector. And so he reaches out to Rwanda, the arch enemy, and tries to strengthen cooperation in military. He invites the Rwandan army into the country to conduct military operations. This is all hush-hush. This was not very official because Rwanda is deeply, deeply unpopular. And he also strengthens economic ties with Rwanda. Rwanda's main flagship airplane, Rwanda Air, starts daily flights from Kigali to Kinshasa. Rwandan gold mining companies strike up a very important deal in gold mining in the Congo. They get involved in all kinds of sectors in the DRC. DRC is huge, vast. Rwanda is tiny. It's an enormous economic opportunity for Rwanda, and Rwanda has certain assets that it can bring to the table. And so Tshisekedi reaches out, and things go quite well up until 2021. Rwanda conducts lots of military operations in the Congo, including killing the head of their arch rivals. They're called the FDLR today, but these are the remnants. They're run by some of the people who participated in the 1994 genocide. And things are going well up until mid-2021. And then the spark for this current issue, this problem, doesn't really come from the Congo itself. It comes actually from a different regional relationship. So Congo is sort of condemned to suffer the problems of other countries. What happens is Uganda, the country to the north of Rwanda, has had difficult relations with Rwanda for a long time, for reasons we can't get into. And they had closed their border posts with Rwanda. There was a tit for tat accusations in terms of destabilization between Uganda and Rwanda. Things were very, very tense. And in mid-2021, Tshisekedi, Congolese president, decides that he wants to double down on actually intensifying cooperation with Uganda. It strikes up a road building deal, some economic trade deals with Uganda. And Rwanda sees this with great suspicion, assumes that Uganda is actually in the Eastern Congo to destabilize Rwanda. And then the clincher is in November 2021, there's a terrorist attack in downtown Kampala, the capital of Uganda, that kills a bunch of people. And the Islamist rebels that are accused of having perpetrated this attack are based in the Eastern Congo. And so almost overnight, Uganda and the Congo agree on joint military operations against these Islamist Ugandan rebels that are based in the jungles of northeastern Congo. And Uganda deploys thousands of troops into the Congo, ostensibly to attack this ADF, they're called, this terrorist armed group. And the Rwandans say this is actually an attempt to destabilize us. They're deploying troops there, and they're going to come and destabilize us. And so the Rwanda backing to the M23 rebellion is actually much more about, which they then immediately started doing almost, is much more about this beef that existed back then between Uganda and Rwanda. At least that was a trigger. So that then brought about the escalation. The M23 was created and backed. Relations actually improved between Uganda and Rwanda, but Rwanda doubles down and sends what we believe to be 3,000 to 4,000 special forces. Rwanda has one of the most professional armies on the African continent. They're very, very well disciplined. They're very well trained. They have a very high morale. And they are very well equipped. And because we are now operating in an age of cell phones, but also drones and satellites, we have a very good idea about where these people are, what they look like. And so there are many pictures now showing Rwandan troops deployed in the Eastern Congo, and all of the fancy night vision goggles, laser targeted machine guns, snipers, drones, etc., that they have at their disposal. So they push these people into the Congo. And the Congolese responded, as unfortunately as they often do, because they have such a weak command and control within their army, because they themselves have not invested in creating a strong army. We can get into that if you want. They responded to this by proliferating the actors on the battlefield. So what they did is they recruited a bunch of local militias. They're called the Wazalendo, which in Swahili means the Patriots. Basically, these are just existing militias that have been rehatted, and the Congolese, and that some of them used to fight the Congolese army. The Congolese army said, actually, let's put our beef aside. Let's go at this common enemy together, the M23. And so you have these ramshackle militias, many of whom recruit on ethnic lines, not well disciplined. Some of them involve child soldiers who are almost the first line of defense against the M23. And so you can very easily imagine how that's going to go sideways in terms of abuses against civilians and so on and so forth. And then not only do they do that, but they hire a bunch of private security contractors, mercenaries, if you will, two in particular, who help them supply and maintain their aircraft and helicopters, but some of them are actually deployed in training and on the front lines. And these are two outfits that predominantly recruit in Eastern Europe. And so they're also there on the battlefield. And then thirdly, the Congolese, initially they make recourse to the East African community. This is a regional bloc that's actually never got involved in peacekeeping missions before. And they say, can you help us? And both Congo and Rwanda are members of the East African community. The Congolese said, can you help us solve this issue? And then so also on the battlefield enter a peacekeeping force led by the Kenyan government. But the Congolese are very, very quickly are unhappy with this peacekeeping force because they don't do what the Congolese want them to do, which is basically just attack the M23, dismantle them by force. Instead, they become an interposition force, and they become a buffer between the two sides. And actually, one could argue, allow the M23 to strengthen themselves. So the Congolese get very upset and basically kick them out. And since the beginning of this year, they have been replaced with a South African Development Community peacekeeping mission led by South Africa, Tanzania, with the participation of Malawi. that are also on the battlefield, but have also struggled really to make a military difference. I think they at least were more in line with the Congolese vision of attacking and dismantling the M23, but they haven't made much headway either. And so it's a very complicated situation on the battlefields in the Eastern Congo. You have the M23 actually undeterred by all of these different actors pushing and enlarging their territory. They now occupy a large territory stretching from the Ugandan border in the north all the way down to the outskirts of Goma. They have completely encircled the town of Goma. They've cut off the town of Goma, at least from the rest of the Congo. And they are pushing into Masisi territory to the west. So they're occupying a very large area of land. And the situation, of course, has been terrible for Congolese civilians. This conflict alone has probably displaced around 1.5 to 2 million civilians. And that brings the total number of displaced people in the Congo to 7 million people, which is the second largest displacement crisis in the world after the Sudan. So it's a very, very concerning situation.
So I have a follow-up question and a clarification question. I'll ask a clarification question first. The M23 then seem to be the real winners in this conflict for now. They are, of course, nothing is said and done yet. They are related to Rwanda by ethnic ties. How closely do they cooperate with the Rwandan government? Are they more autonomous, or are they more of a proxy?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's important because often it's assumed, and even in news stories, you can see this, there's almost an implicit shorthand that says Congolese Tutsi rebels. And then people almost understand that the reason that they're fighting with the Rwandans is because they're Tutsi, right? And that's certainly a factor. Again, the Tootsi community we're talking about has lived in this part of the Congo since some of them have lived in this part of the Congo since pre-colonial times. Some of them came during the colonial period. They've been here for a long time. And many members of that Tootsi community have a complicated relationship with the Rwandan government. Many of these, let's take Sultani Makenga, for example, who's the commander-in-chief of the M23. He's an ethnic Tutsi from the Congo, born and raised in the Congo. And in the early 1990s, as Paul Kagame was leading a rebellion against the then government of Rwanda, many Tutsi throughout the region, there's a large Tutsi community throughout the Great Lakes region, in the Congo, but also elsewhere. Many Tutsi throughout the region saw that this was their battle, and they joined in with Kagame back then. So Makenga actually joined the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the Rwandan Patriotic Army, as in their attack on Rwanda that culminated in the genocide in 1994. And so he has very long-standing relationships with the Rwandan government, with the Rwandan government. On the other hand, he feels himself deeply Congolese. And so when Rwanda then invaded the Congo several years later, he participated in that invasion. In fact, they all did. In fact, many Congolese Tutsi says, look, we've helped you liberate Rwanda. Help us now liberate our own country, and then leave us alone. And so when they invaded in 1996, they toppled Mobutu, big success. And then the Rwandans stayed on. And when they were kicked out, and when they were starting to leave to go back to Rwanda, they said, okay, now you have to come back with us. You're Rwandan too. After which the Congolese Tutsi, including Makenga, said, no, we're not Rwandan. We're Congolese Tutsi. We have our own history, a very particular history that is not your history. We happen to speak the same language, but we're not Rwandan. Let's be very clear about this. This is our home. And back then, Makenga was arrested actually for quite some time by the Rwandans. And he's known to have somebody who has beef with the Rwandans going back then, but not just because of that. There's been many incidents between him and the Rwandans. So personally, one cannot assume that just because these people are Tutsi, that their interests align with Rwanda's interests. And in fact, you've had over the years
trying to set up a Tutsi stan or a greater Rwanda state. It's not that sort of conflict.
Unfortunately, there are many conspiracy theorists who are pushing that line. And it is, I mean, there's a lot of ethnic chauvinism in here. I mean, which is, I think, very important to grapple with, and unfortunately has not been grappled. So many Congolese do think that there's something about the Tutsi. There's a Tutsi enterprise here, a Tutsi objective, a Tutsi land, or they also call it the Tootsi Empire. Ironically, a lot of these ideas harken back to colonial ideas. If you permit the slight tangent here, the colonial governments in Uganda, in Rwanda, and the Congo, be they British, be they French, be they German, many of them operated based on a myth called the Hamitic myth, believing that all civilizations
Sorry, Jason. It looks like your connection is being interrupted here. Oops, there we go.
Hamitic myth. Okay, so you can unfortunately have to clip this together. I'm sorry.
Oh, we always end up having to clip something, so you're not adding any extra trouble.
So the irony is that a lot of these notions of Tutsi-ness, they call it the Tootsi Empire or Tutsi land. There are these, there are these conspiracies that circulate out there. They're very prominent. There was just recently a colloquium in Kinshasa hosting a celebrated French Cameroonian writer that was all about this. That, unfortunately, propagating these conspiracies, these very harmful conspiracy theories, these date back. Ironically, they date back to the colonial period. Ironically, because they're presented as inherently African and nationalist, but ironically, they date back to the colonial period, where the various colonial enterprises, Belgian, French, and German, English, all believed that all civilization in Africa could not possibly be African because Africans are not capable of civilization. And so they thought that these civilizations, the Great Wall of Zimbabwe, the rock-hewn churches of Ethiopia, and the Rwanda monarchy itself, that they were Semitic in origin. They were from the Middle East. They were Hamitic in the sense that Ham, the son of Noah, was chased out to the south by Noah. This goes back to the Bible. And so Hamitic civilizations. And so they thought the Rwandans were actually not Africans. And so to a certain extent, these conspiracies harken back to colonial conspiracies and manipulations of history, racist manipulations of history. So anyway, setting that aside, it is very important, I think, to understand that Rwandan and Congolese Tutsi share a language, share an ethnic identity. They see themselves as affiliated one with each other, but they also have a very complicated relationship going back, centuries, actually. And in fact, some of the Kenya Rwanda-speaking populations you find in the Eastern Congo, let's take South Kivu, for example, where they're called Banyamulenge. The reason they're there is they fled from Rwanda because during the centralization of power in Rwanda in the 19th century, they didn't want to be part of that. They wanted to have a much more looser horizontal organization. And Rwanda is a very tightly controlled hierarchical country. And so they fled from that. And so to say that, and we've seen this time and time again in Congolese history, where the Tutsi in the Eastern Congo actually fight against Rwanda. There's been many iterations of this. Even today, on the front lines of the battles in the Eastern Congo against the M23, you will find Congolese Tutsi fighting against them. And so I think it's very important not to essentialize ethnicity and to say that this is essentially about ethnicity. No, this is about power. This is about survival. This is about dignity. And of course, ethnicity plays a role in all of those things, but it's not about ethnicity.
So the goal is not creating Tutsi land, what is the goal? What is the M23's end game?
Yeah, again, a very good question. And this one, I think we have to be clear that we don't know exactly, because we don't know, we can't see into the heads of the Rwandan officials making decisions or the M23 making decisions. But let me give you what I think are probably some of the factors involved. First of all, M23's goals and Rwanda's goals are not the same. It's fairly clear. In fact, going back, I mean, if I was Makenga, I'd be very afraid. Or if I was the various heads of the M23, I'd be quite afraid, because in the past, Rwanda has consistently sacrificed people for their good. Sacrificed M23, or the predecessor to the M23 was a CNDP, sacrificed these leaders for their own good. So M23 goals, I think, are probably several-fold. First of all, survival for its leaders. So the foot soldiers they recruit, the cannon fodder, if you will, have obviously are in it for something else. The elites of the M23 are in it probably, these guys have been kicked out of the Congo during the last M23 rebellion, 2012, 2013, and they were sitting in refugee camps, in army camps rather, in Uganda and Rwanda. And so they're just trying to resuscitate their own careers, their own survival. Yes, I am sure that in the way that they justify this to themselves, they're saying that this is also about our community, our Tootsi community. A large part of the Congolese Tootsi community from North Kivu province has had to flee. There are very, very, especially in rural areas, there are virtually no Congolese Tutsi lands. And there are someplace on around 80,000 Tutsi, probably Congolese Tutsi, in camps in Rwanda. And so I'm sure they justify this to themselves, saying we want to bring our families home. Unfortunately, it's just very difficult for me to see how that would be possible through the barrel of the gun. Reconciling people through the barrel. In fact, what we've seen happen again and again and again, Rwanda and the M23 say this is about protecting the Tutsi, and Rwanda in particular says this is about defeating the genocidaire, the people who carried out the genocide in 1994, who still lurk in the Eastern Congo. Unfortunately, what we've seen, and it's important to address those, that plays a role. But what we've seen, I mean, there are FDLR in the Eastern Congo. They were dramatically weakened by the time the conflict started. But there are some there. Some of them did indeed participate in the 1994 genocide, and some of them do continue to say things that are extremely xenophobic against and even genocidal about the Tutsi community. And the Congolese Tutsi community has been persecuted and discriminated against. Those things are all true. What is not true is that there was any imminent threat to Rwanda in the run-up to the M23 creation in November of 2021, or resurgence. And there was also no uptick in anti-Tutsi sentiment. But what happened was once the M23 was created, or recreated in November of 2021, then there was, because of the creation of the M23, a radical uptick in anti-Tutsi sentiment across the Congo. And because the Congolese army often defends itself by creating coalitions with militia, there was collaboration between the Congolese army and the FDLR in response to the M23. And so the M23, to a certain extent, has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yes, there is anti-Tutsi sentiment, and there is this FDLR collaboration, but it's in response to the M23 and not because, so they get the sequencing reversed convenient. And so that's to address what they say. But I think about our community, it's about their careers. What's Rwanda in? This is a much more difficult thing to answer, I think. And because it's so difficult to answer, when I speak with diplomats and donors, they'll often respond to, now there's no doubt that they are backing the M23, but in the early days, many diplomats would tell me, but it's not in Rwanda's interest to back the M23. And so ipso facto, they're not backing the M23. So they would project their own understanding of Rwanda from the outside onto what they think they're actually doing. Because it does seem counterintuitive. I mean, here is Rwanda. Rwanda is a country that cares probably its biggest export in the world is its brand. It cares about its brand so much that they have bought, the logo. They put their logo, "Visit Rwanda," on Paris Saint-Germain, the largest French soccer team, Arsenal, one of the best English soccer teams. They brand themselves. They've created coalitions with Starbucks, with Pentecostal churches. I mean, it's about a brand. Rwandans, why would they want to go and undermine their quote unquote Singapore of Africa vision by doing something like this? It's bad press for them, if nothing else. And I think to understand that, we have to understand several things. First, everything in Rwandan politics revolves around the genocide, for both in sincere terms and in opportunistic terms. So the bedrock legitimacy of the RPF, the ruling party in power, is the fact it harkens back to the genocide. They are the people, according to their telling of history, that brought an end to the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. And they are there. The thing that they have provided to the Rwandan population, most of all, yes, they provided actually quite a bit of economic growth and prosperity to especially the elites. But the thing that it provided that's most important is security. Rwanda as a country is the safest country in Africa. You walk around Rwanda in the capital Kigali at 2 o'clock in the morning on your cell phone, and you do not have to be worried, for the most part, of somebody stealing your phone. And if they do steal your phone, you go to the police, and the police will actually find your phone. So it's an extremely, Singapore for Africa for a reason. It's an extremely centralized, security-obsessed country, and they've done that very well. And the bedrock of that is that they are the bulwark. The RPF has said, there will never be a genocide again. We'll provide you 100% security. So that's their legitimacy is at stake. And so it is not inconvenient for Rwanda to remind people of the genocidaire lurking in the forests in Eastern Congo. So there's that element to it. But I realize when I say that, I sound like they're creating a fictitious threat from outside the country to justify their regime. There may be some of that going on. But this is also it's a discursive thing. It dominates everything. So many people sincerely believe it's the 1% doctrine. If there is 1%, they will refer to Dick Cheney, right? Dick Cheney famously said, if there is 1% possibility that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, we must treat it as an absolute certainty. They've quoted this to me verbatim. They said, if there is who cares about, these genocidaires you talk about, yeah, they're in the Eastern Congo. They represent nothing. These guys are a bunch of hoodlums with dirty AK-47s and flip-flops. And they don't, you guys are one of the most professional armies in the continent. Why are you so worried about this? They will say, verbatim, if there is 1% chance that they will invade Rwanda, we must treat it as an absolute certainty. They will say, if Al-Qaeda was based in Tijuana, wouldn't the United States invade Tijuana? Would they even hesitate for 1 second? Would there be any discussion about it? No. So if FDLR is their Al-Qaeda, and we will treat it as an absolute certainty. They're on record. There's been videos of Army generals giving speeches to their officer corps saying, the defense of our country, if you're living in a compound, where do you put the guards in the compound? You put them outside the compounds. And in order to defend our country, we have to be outside of our country to defend our country, right? And so, to a certain extent, it's what the Pakistani government calls strategic depth in Afghanistan. The Rwandans use the same term. This is strategic depth in the Eastern Congo. We have to be in the Eastern Congo to protect our. So there's a security element. Some of it's opportunistic.
The same logic
some
would
of it's
dictate that. Sorry. So, of course, the same logic would dictate that Congo ought to have its own forces stationed within Rwanda and every other nation.
Well,
it's impossible to universalize.
Yes, they don't care so much about this, but yes, absolutely. And so you can see how this gets. But there's also an economic element to this, which is important to mention, which is that Rwanda, which is a small, poor, landlocked country, needs to a certain extent to have access to opportunities elsewhere outside of the country. And unfortunately, I think, especially in the last 6 or 7 years, this has changed quite a bit. People talk about Rwanda's plundering of minerals back in 1997, 1998, but Rwanda's actually making, which did happen, but Rwanda's actually making much more money more recently off more legal trade. Let me describe it like that. So it's going back several years now, before the M23 resurgence, the rise, several things happened. Gold prices shot through the roof around the world. Gold prices are an absolute high at the moment. They've doubled in the last 4 or 5 years. Eastern Congo produces a lot of gold. They produce a lot of gold in pick and shovel artisanal mining, right? So this is stuff that's very easy. If you're an armed group, it's very easy to tax. And it's also goes through networks of middlemen. And those networks of middlemen depend on financing. They need to have money to buy the gold, and they depend on security, right? And so this is a great market for an operator like Rwanda to get involved in. It doesn't actually send its troops to do anything with regards to those networks. It just needs the Eastern Congo to be a mess, unstable, and harass them. And what these networks do is they seek financing from Rwanda, and they seek protection from Rwanda, and they seek a place where they can export their gold without being taxed exorbitant. And Rwanda fulfills all those criteria. And so Rwanda's largest export is gold. 25 to 45%, depending on which year you talk about, of its exports are gold. More than tourism brings in terms of cash, more than tea and coffee, that's its traditional exports, gold. By the way, that's also the main export for Uganda and Burundi, the 2 countries to the north and south of Rwanda, is Congolese gold that's smuggled out to these countries. And that's not a story of Rwandan army being
the main import then, not the main export.
It's the main export. So it's smuggled into Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi, and then exported as Ugandan gold, as Burundian gold, and as Rwandan gold and almost all goes to Dubai. It goes to the UAE and the Gulf. And if you look at, and so there's quite good figures on all of this there. So what does Rwanda want? That was your initial question. Rwanda wants security, obviously, and it wants prosperity, obviously, and to a certain extent, instability in the Eastern Congo. They benefit from instability in Eastern Congo for both of those things. They benefit, they're able to secure their country, they're able to solidify the legitimacy of the RPF, and they're able to further their economy. Now, it's a somewhat short-sighted vision, and I think, and in all of this, you need to understand the way the RPF works. It's in some things it's very rational and very efficient. It's some of the most technocratic, efficient. It's an authoritarian government. It works in a very rational and technocratic, with lots of accountability, all reporting to the boss. But in certain things, it's also slightly dysfunctional. And so, especially when it comes to security decisions, it's bunker-minded, and it can exaggerate threats. I would say paranoid, but I would say they exaggerate threats. And so also this has also contributed to this extremely controlled, obsessive, and militaristic approach towards its policy in Congo. And so I think that is my best guess at what's driving that combination of factors that I just laid out. Is my best guess at what's driving Rwandan policy in the Congo.
Sort of like the Roman Empire. Then you've got a border on one side of which is much greater relative political stability. They don't mind if there's instability and small infighting groups across the border, as long as nobody is capable of ganging up and then crossing in.
This is the way, unfortunately, you don't have to go back. Yes, the Roman Empire, but many empires around the world have benefited through this mix of total security on the one hand, but complete insecurity for other populations on the other hand. Yes. And then they project on the people who are in complete insecurity. They say, oh, these guys are barbarians. These guys are thugs. These guys are, and that's exactly how Rwandans talk about the Congolese. Look at them, they're extremists. Oh my goodness, look at what they're doing, And for the Congolese, they're not extremists, they're just upset. They're upset by having been trampled on and humiliated by incursion and invasion after invasion. And yes, some of that translates as and is expressed through ethnic hate speech and virulence. Unfortunately, that's absolutely true. But just to say it as such, I think, and you can make many, many parallels what's happening in the Middle East at the moment, Israel, Gaza, for example, and elsewhere. But that essentially very much is the history of that relationship.
It sounds good to be a Rwandan, but that's no way to build Africa in the long term.
Yeah, that's
So in the
true.
long term, we have an idea of where Rwanda is trying to get, or at least where it's trying to stay. Um, how might Congo seek to progress this situation? How would international actors like South Africa and East African Community, the United States, be pushing?
Well, I think the M23 crisis that we spent most of our time talking about here is actually, despite everything I've said, the easier conundrum to solve, in the sense that there is the reason there's an M23. M23 depends so much on an external actor. And that external actor, Rwanda, is actually extremely vulnerable to international pressure. That, as has happened in the past on several occasions, if that international pressure is brought to bear, Rwanda can pull the plug. And very quickly, if Rwanda pulls the plug, the M23 will collapse. I have almost no doubt about that. That's exactly how its previous iteration in 2012, 2013, there was the initial M23 rebellion. There was pressure brought on Rwanda. $250 million in aid was suspended to Rwanda. President Obama called President Kagame, and the plug was pulled. And within months or even weeks, the M23 collapsed. So now, of course, that doesn't address many of the underlying problems, but that is, I think, an important part of de-escalating the current situation. So pressure on Rwanda, I think, needs to be part of this puzzle. But I think also, I mean, there have to be, I think, okay, let's take the M23 crisis. You do need to do something about this FDLR militia in the Eastern Congo. It's not helping anybody that they're still there. They're primarily a threat to Congolese. And so I think there needs to be steps made by the Congolese to deal with that, for sure. I think in particular, there needs to be done, something needs to be done about this third rail of Congolese politics, which is about indigeneity, who is really Congolese and who is not, and in particular about the Congolese Tootsi community. Tootsi and Hutu community, because they're also involved. And it's something that no Congolese leader wants to touch because it's so radioactive and it will get into so much trouble. But something needs to be done about it. And Tshisekedi, actually, the current president, has been more willing to talk about this than others, except he knows, he's in a very reluctant sort of fashion, but so I think something needs to be done about talking about the past. Each side is locked into their own trauma, and it's deep trauma. But Congolese Tutsi, all they see is you go to some villages in South Kivu where the Banyamulenge, these Tutsi live, every family has lost somebody. And then you go to the neighboring community, and all they'll tell you about is how the Tutsi came when they were in power, they came and they massacred. And neither side will see the other side's suffering and hurt and trauma. It's because there's not really been, outside of some local initiatives that have been important, there's been no state initiative. There has been no larger initiative to talk about past and history. And so that includes, you can say Truth and Reconciliation Commission if you want, but it's a big bundle of things. Transitional justice is always a big bundle of things. It could be court-based initiatives. It could be, local grassroots initiatives. I think in particular, educational initiatives. People need to talk about this through acts of memory and museums and speeches and in schools. It needs to be part of national discourse. I mean, you really have to grapple, and that's difficult. That's hard, especially because it's such an explosive issue for a politician. So that's one thing that needs to be done. I talked about this Congolese community of Tutsi that are in Rwanda in camps. Some of them have been in camps for going on 30 years now, 25 plus years. They should be able to come home. That's going to be a very thorny issue because there's questions of land involved. But something needs to be done. Otherwise, it's just going to boil up again at some point about those issues. But the most important, so the short term, I mean, all of those things I said are easy. Obviously, they're not easy, but they're fairly clear. And then there needs to be, there needs to be a peace process. There is no peace process, right? It's just 101. There's a conflict without a peace process. You need a peace process, and a peace process, you need to either you can involve the actors in the conflicts in that peace process, or your response is we're just going to use a military response and eliminate them. But if you have neither of them, then you don't really have a peace process. And at the moment, you have neither of them. The Congolese government does periodically say there's 100 armed groups in the country. We're just going to deal with them. We're going to get rid of them. We're going to crush them. Fine, but they're not able to do so. They've been incapable of doing so. And so we need to have a broader peace process that at least allows those who want out into a demobilization program. There's parts of this that will engage, because the issues I've laid out about Tutsi issues, there are other similar local grassroots issues across the Eastern Congo that have fed into all these conflicts at the local level. You need to deal with the local dimensions of these conflicts at the local level. You need to, for those who continue to be spoilers, who continue to abuse their power, yes, there could be a forceful option reserved for them. But you need to have a comprehensive peace process. There is none. There is no peace process. So broadly speaking, you need to have a peace process. And the third thing I would say, and that, that will require money, it will require logistics. I would love to have that be an African-led peace process, as we've seen elsewhere on the continent. The days of UN peacekeeping missions are going out of vogue. They're retreating everywhere, including in the Congo, where it's still one of the largest peacekeeping missions in the world. And so there needs to be a peace process. The last thing I would say, and the most difficult, a generational challenge, is the Congolese state. The Congolese state, since the colonial time, has invested in its own reproduction and its own survival at the detriment to the detriment of the Congolese population. And you can see this everywhere. And so there needs to be a serious, and this is going to be very difficult, and it's not going to come from the Congolese elites itself. One of the reasons the Congolese Security Service is so rotten, for lack of a better word, and this is the Congolese president himself who's called his own army. He says there's a mafia inside my army. And the defense minister has said the same thing. They're right. There are mafia-like operators. And the reason for this is that the political elites have consistently seen the army as much as a threat as anything else. And so to diffuse that in a threat because of a coup, right? Potential coups, which there have been many attempts in Congolese history. And so they have diffused that threat by sending them far away.
To grow.
They've diffused that threat by sending them far away, allowing them to get rich. Again, your analogy to ancient Rome is not too far. Allowing them to get rich, tax farming, basically, and staying far out of the capital. And that has been very successful as an elite survival strategy, and it's been awful for the population. And so they need to reform that. That's not a reform that's going to come from within. They're not going to wake up one morning and say, this is a bad system. There needs to be pressure to do that. And that's why I say it's a generational struggle to do that. But that's going to be impossible to do without solving these immediate security problems. There's no way an incumbent, you can't reform the army while the army's at war. It just doesn't work. You can't demobilize armed groups while those armed groups are at war. And so you need to have the short-term de-escalation, and putting pressure on Rwanda to withdraw is important for that. It will then create the space for these longer-term processes that are going to be extremely difficult, obviously. And outside actors obviously play a role in this. But I think primarily it's how can we help Congolese movements, Congolese population, Congolese civil society hold their own government to account to change this really perverse equilibrium that they're in which the Congolese people are harassed and preyed on by their own state and government.
So instability works as a short-term strategy. It helps you perhaps keep your enemies from combining against each other and becoming strong enough to overthrow you. But in the long term, you'll never be able to suppress endemic violence that way without building something more stable.
I mean, it's a strategy. It's a very dangerous strategy. It's not, and I'm not even sure it's a strategy. It's a tactic more than a strategy. It's not, I don't think anybody comes to power with a long-term vision of doing this. It's sort of what they find in front of them, like, oh, okay, well, let's shuffle these people around and try to survive in the former Yemeni president, Saleh, he's called it dancing on the heads of snakes, because you're just trying to make sure that none of these snakes bite you. And so it's worked quite well for these Congolese elites. In the end of the day, it's a terrible strategy, not just for the Congolese population, but we just had an attempted. There was just this past weekend an attempted coup in the capital, Kinshasa, in which a very, very bizarre event, in which a group of ragtag soldiers from the diaspora was able to infiltrate the capital and take the presidential palace. The president wasn't there. He was at home, doesn't really sleep there. In the middle of the night, they took the presidential palace, and then their leader was killed and it was put down. It was bizarre, weird, almost parts of it were comical, but also really indicative of the kind of government you're dealing with. This is a government where a ragtag group of 50 guys is able to take the presidential palace that's supposed to be protected by the presidential guard. So yes, it's a strategy. It's been functional so far, but you can see the cracks and how it can backfire quite easily.
Thank you very much for speaking with us, Jason. This has been enlightening.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.